Okay, good morning, everybody. And in a way, today we're going to do a jump to the side to start discussing an entirely different topic, but it's not really an entirely different topic. We're going to start to discuss the plants. I can't say it in American, so you're just going to have to get used to me saying plant. I can't say plant. It doesn't sound right in my mouth. For some reason, I can't do it. So we're going to be discussing how the plants arose and also the tremendous importance in the structuring of our planet. We underestimate the importance of plants in the global ecology, maybe because we find them less charismatic or something than the animals, but nonetheless, they are critically important. They have been critically important for the entire history of the planet. And we really do need to understand something about them if we want to understand biology in general. We're going to discuss in the first section a bit about plant evolution, and also about how plants came up onto land. And then later on, we'll talk a bit about plant physiology as well, and then a little bit about plant reproduction. We'll get as far as we can in the discussion, but would rather, as usual, I would rather teach less better than more badly. And so we'll just see how far we get before the end of the semester in our discussion. Okay, so the first thing to note is that initially in the evolution of our planet, land was completely barren. And it existed like that, where there was barren land for billions of years. All life evolved in aquatic systems and centered around aquatic systems. It was only very gradually that on the margins of the water, some colonization began to take place. For billions of years, the only living things which could survive on land were actually bacteria. A very important bacteria because they were cyanobacteria, they were photosynthetic bacteria, and they were able to colonize to a certain extent, particularly along the margins of the water and within a reasonable distance, and then gradually move further inland, provided they were provided with regular rain, etc. And they did that about 1.2 billion years ago. And they certainly did provide some modification of the land structures, but not a tremendous amount. But around about 500 million years ago, the first small plants evolved on the margins of water and began to penetrate into the land. And as they did so, even though they were very small, and they to us would probably look rather insignificant, they extensively modified the areas that they colonized. They began, for instance, to create soil. They could break down rock and modify it. And contribute organic matter, etc., to really start to build up soil. The emergence onto land of a number of groups happened relatively simultaneously. Probably the first to penetrate really significantly were the fungi, but they were followed by the plants and then by animals as well. But we can picture the initial colonization of land being along the margins of the water, forming fairly dense growths of whatever had made its way up there. And then that would create habitats which were suitable for primitive land-dwelling animals to begin to move in, things like the amphibia or the early fish amphibia and then the amphibia. That's those kinds of animals. So around about 500 million years ago, this is relatively recently. If you think about geological history of the Earth, this is relatively recent that the land has begun to be colonized, and plants as colonizers were critically important because they began to extensively modify the land and make it more suitable for other forms to follow them. The plants are an incredibly diverse group. There are about 290,000 species, but new species keep getting discovered. Unfortunately, our current ecological crisis on the planet, many plants are also critically endangered, and many species are being lost, and entire plant ecosystems are being extensively modified, particularly by global climate change, and then also by the impact of human beings destroying habitat and that sort of thing. So we need to just get some terms clear in our head. The first is this word plant. What do we mean by a plant? Well, a plant is a multicellular autotroph, which is not a protist. It is a multicellular autotroph, which is not in actual fact an alga. And we'll see the algae in a minute and realize their importance. The algae and the plants certainly are closely related, but we make a distinction between the two. And we, in general, plants are regarded as being land plants. They are multicellular autotrophic organisms which evolved on and for the colonization of land. Even though some of them have specialized and have gone back into the water, those ones are also regarded as land plants because they have land plant ancestors. So we should have that distinction clear in our minds. The singular importance of both algae and of the plants is that they are the planet's autotrophs, most important autotrophs. They're not the only autotrophs, but they are certainly on land the most important autotrophs. That is, they can take carbon dioxide, they can take water, and they can put them together with the sun's energy, and they can manufacture the first complex biological molecules, which then go to fund the plant itself with molecules to build biomass and energy. But the plants then can be used as a food source by everything else. So we are as animals, we are heterotrophs, and all the heterotrophs are absolutely dependent in one way or another upon the plants for fixing molecules and for fixing energy. Remember think back to our first semester in biology, how we learned that on our planet, we only have a set number of molecules. The molecules need to be recycled all the time. And complex molecules ultimately are broken down to carbon dioxide and water. Plants take those and put them back together again into a useful biological form, into useful biological molecules. But at the same time, the ecosystems of the Earth continually lose energy. We radiate energy out to space. We cannot recycle energy. And as a result, we need a continual source of energy on the planet, and that is provided to us by the autotrophs, by those organisms which can use sunlight and simple molecules to create complex biological molecules. Now, in addition, the plants do something else for us, which is to provide us with oxygen. The autotrophs, rather. It's not only the plants, the algae do it as well. They provide us with oxygen. All of the oxygen in our atmosphere, in fact, is of biological origin. And its advent into the atmosphere occurred billions of years ago when bacteria developed an ability to photosynthesize. They rapidly changed the nature of the atmosphere. And now, on land, the plants are also responsible for taking up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, building it into complex biological molecules, and at the same time releasing oxygen, on which all of the animals depend. So our physiologies, the plant and animal physiologies, are intimately intertwined. both for nutrition, for breathing, for everything. We are closely intertwined with the plants. That is one of the reasons we need to understand a lot about them if we to understand our planet. I will just say, I just want to add one thing. This issue of the plants locking up carbon dioxide as organic matter, you will see very frequently in discussions about global climate change. What is happening in global climate change? We are building up carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere to such an extent from fossil fuel burning, etc., that we are disturbing the heat balance of the planet. And one of the things that people often say, we need to plant more forests. We need more forests, everything else, because plants take up carbon dioxide and build it into inert biological molecules such as cellulose. Well, that is true, and you can certainly use them to sop up some of the carbon dioxide, but realize that that is a temporary, usually a temporary solution. It may last for thousands of years, whatever, but eventually that biological material is liable to decay, and it will decay back to carbon dioxide. So this planting forests is not, it's a good thing to do, but it's not necessarily a permanent solution to the problems of increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So let's have a look at this wonderful picture of a forest floor. Here we see all of the land plants that we are going to be discussing displayed for us. This is exactly what you'd see if you walked into a forest. And first of all, look on this log here, and you'll see that it's covered with small plants, which are mostly in groups associated with the mosses. We call these the bryophytes. They are very small plants. They were the first plants to evolve on land. There are strict limitations to their growth and everything for reasons I'll explain in a minute. One of the main reasons that they are limited is that they have no vasculature. They just have no way of distributing water and nutrients throughout the plant if it's absorbed through roots or whatever. So they are limited in size because of that. So these are the really we regard as being the most primitive of the land plants. This is also a relatively primitive land plant, but much more advanced than this. Shares many characteristics with the mosses and everything, and this is a fern. But ferns have a huge advantage, and that is that they have evolved a vasculature. That is, they have tubes running through them, which can distribute water and nutrients from roots all the way through, but it does something else. It also provides the plant with strength and allows the plant to grow upwards. Indeed, many of the ferns are small, but where there are some huge ferns as well. And in geological history, there were some immense ferns, tree-sized ferns, which were actually really common. So these are the relatively primitive plants. Behind here are the advanced land plants, and these are flowering plants. And they have very special characteristics, and it is the flowering plants which have been able to penetrate very far inland. These plants here, the mosses, ferns, still remain tied to water for a very important reason that we'll see. These land plants are not so dependent. They still require water, but they are not absolutely dependent on the presence of standing water at some point or another. So missing from this picture here is an intervening group between these primitive plants and the more advanced plants. And those are the gymnosperms, things like the conifers, the pine trees, and those sorts of plants, which is a shame in the terms of the story told by this picture, because actually for a very, very long time, until about 65 million years ago, the gymnosperms were the dominant vegetation all over the planet. Wherever vegetation occurred, it was most likely going to be gymnosperm. The flowering plants only came to prominence from about 70, 75 million years ago up until the present. Okay, so when we look at the evolution of plants, we realize immediately that there are very strong affinities to the algae. The algae, by and large, are, I'd say entirely, are aquatic organisms. You will find them on land, but you'll only find them on land in very damp environments. So it really is still an aquatic environment. The algae their organization tends to be relatively simple, but they can achieve very large size. Some of the largest plants on Earth, in actual fact, are, I wouldn't say plants, are distinguished. Okay, some of the largest autotrophs on Earth are algae. If you think about the giant kelps, for example, in the west coast of Africa, the west coast of the United States, they're huge plants. They're huge organisms, rather. So that's the first thing. The algae are very important autotrophs, and they have very key features which are similar to the plants, especially the fact that they share things like the chlorophylls. The chlorophylls in algae and the chlorophylls in plants, there are tremendous similarities between them. There is one particular group of algae that we associate very closely with the evolution of land plants. And this is a group called the charophytes. I'll show you a picture in a minute. And the charophytes and land plants share some really fine, detailed similarities, which make it very unlikely that they are unrelated. And they, for example, you don't have to remember the details of this. All I want you to remember is that in constructing their cellulose cell walls, the charophytes and the land plants share the mechanism by which they do that. And that mechanism is different to all of the other algae that we'll see in a minute. So the charophytes share that really intricate biochemical mechanism. The second thing is, believe it or not, though you may not know this, plants have sperm. They have flagellated sperm, and the flagellated sperm there's flagellated sperm in charophytes as well. Many of the algae have flagellated sperm, but in the charophytes and the land plants, the sperm are extremely similar in structure. So the next thing is, so these things were well known for a long time, and scientists use them to link the two groups. But that linkage has been proved now that we are able to sequence DNA and analyze it, because there is tremendous similarity in affinity in sequence, DNA sequence between the charophytes and the land plants. And it doesn't matter where you take that DNA from, whether you take it from the nucleus or you take it from the chloroplast. Remember, chloroplasts have their own DNA. Or if you take it from the mitochondria also have their own DNA. All of them show a strong linkage between the charophytes and the land plants. That linkage needs to be there's one more. There's just one more similarity that is really important. And that is that they share a very unique polymer. It's a large molecule called sporopollenin. And sporopollenin is a substance which is laid down around a fertilized egg. And in the charophytes, it serves to make this little embryo more durable. If the pond that the charophytes are growing in should dry out, some of them can survive because they have this sporopollenin coat around the zygote. The same substance, which is a very complex substance, is found in land plants and forms part of the coatings around the seed. So there's a very strong link there as well. But we've got to emphasize something, that is, land plants did not arrive from the charophytes. Charophytes didn't evolve into land plants. The charophytes we see today are probably rather different to the earlier charophytes. And in fact, the charophytes and the land plants share a common ancestor. That is the linkage. It's not that land plants arose from charophytes, but they both arose from a common ancestor. In some cases, when you look at the charophytes, you wouldn't believe it. In fact, this one here is called coleochaete, and it's a little obscure flat thing like this. And looking at that doesn't look anything like a land plant, but in fact, this is one of the charophytes that has the strongest affinities to land plants when you look at its molecular biology. When you look at its DNA, coleochaete is one of the closest to the land plants. This one here is called Chara, and it gives its name to that group, the charophytes. There is another one very similar called Nitella, but this is Chara, and it's worth just taking a look at its morphology for a minute, because you can see it has very long cells which make these intervening, they look like stems. It's not a true stem, but it looks like a stem. And then these here on the side, they're not leaves, but they are branches. So it has a long stem-like part with rosettes of branches going up and around it. And if you look very carefully, if you can see there, it has eggs which it holds in the axes of the branches, and they are fertilized to form a zygote, and it's around that the sporopollenin is laid. So these look rather suspicious. They look they are not seeds, but they certainly do some of the things that a seed would do. They contain the embryo, and they contain the embryo in a protective coating. It's not very protective, but it does provide some protection from desiccation. Because many of these species, Chara, etc., they live in temporary freshwater stands, which periodically dry up. So one of the things I want to do is I want you to imagine what Chara looks like when it's in the water. It's a rather attractive looking thing, actually. It's kind of feathery looking, and it floats up, and all of its branches float out, so that all of the plant can receive sunlight, and it just wafts in the water. Now imagine what happens when the water evaporates. Well, the whole plant collapses. It just collapses into a slimy puddle, and it can no longer photosynthesize efficiently or anything. It has to wait for water to come to support it, so the plant can form out in its correct formation. That's important because it points to one of the really important things that has to happen if we're going to take plants up on land. They need to be supported. They need to be able to resist the force of gravity. That is one thing the algae cannot do. They cannot resist the force of gravity. Take away the water and they simply collapse. So this is how we envision the ancestry of the land plants. There was definitely an ancestral alga that led to all of these multicellular autotrophs. One of the very early groups to have just been defined were the red algae, and they still sit way outside. When you look at their molecular biology, they sit way outside all of the other groups. Nonetheless, they arose from a common ancestor. all of the green multicellular autotrophs arose from a common ancestor. And there is still a very, very big aquatic grouping called the chlorophytes, which are bright green. That bright green coloration is a very definitive characteristic, and it is shared with some other groups. It is shared with the charophytes and with the plants, with the land plants. And that's where the viridae part here comes from. I have to move this viridae plantae there. That refers to the fact that they are all green. So all of these groups are green, but two of these groups are algae. The chlorophytes, it's a huge, very important group in marine systems and in freshwater algae, and freshwater rather. And then the charophytes. So the charophytes and the plants share a common ancestor. Charophytes are still extant, they're still alive, you can still find them. And they are put together with the land plants in a clade, and the clade is called the streptophyta. They're put together in a clade for those 4 reasons that I showed you earlier. So that it's important to remember what unites them. But they are very distinctly algae because they have no vasculature for a start. They have no penetration to land. They have none of the characteristics that we see in the land plants. So they are clearly still algae, but there is a very close relationship to the plants. The plants, the plantae, are in this group called the embryophytes. And you'll see later on the reason that we give them that name, because they nurture an embryo. And that nurturing of the embryo is one of the things that allows them to penetrate onto land. The embryo, for a certain extent, is cared for, if you like, or its survival is ensured by a period of association with the parent plant. So that is why they're called the embryophytes. So I got you to envision what happens if I go to a pond with algae and I take the water away, that will collapse. So what was the advantage? What's the advantage of moving up onto land? Well, early on, first of all, there was lots of carbon dioxide, which is very good for photosynthesis. There was nothing else was using the land, so there was lots of nutrients, minerals and things in the soil. There was nobody to eat you. And also, initially, there were very few pathogens. So initially, movement onto land was could have been a tremendously advantageous thing for all of the groups that we've talked about, the plants and the animals and everything else. They could, if they were pioneers, they gained tremendous advantage. However, moving up onto land has its dangers. And the first thing is you no longer have water to support you. Water supports the organism through buoyancy against the forces of gravity. There's no gravity in water. You're essentially weightless. And as a result, the organism does not have to devote a lot of energy to the creation of supporting structure. But once you move up onto land, you have to have some degree of supporting structure to resist the forces of gravity, or else you've got to go flat along the ground. The second thing is, of course, you've moved out of the water. You've moved away from water, and the scarcity of water is going to be a tremendous problem. It's certainly going to limit initial penetration far onto land. Initially, organisms are going to be limited to the very margins of the land, and they are limited by 2 things. The first thing is that they need water. And they need a constant source of water for their physiology. The second thing is they need water to reproduce. And penetration far onto land cannot take place until organisms have evolved ways of obtaining water, storing water, and reproducing independent of water. So we're going to see all of those things happen. We've already seen them happen when we talked about evolution of animals, but we're going to see the same processes take place with the plants as well. So one of the characteristics, both of algae and of the plants, and especially, and it's especially obvious in the primitive plants, it's still present in the higher plants, but it's a little bit less obvious, is that these organisms alternate between multicellular stages. And they have a stage of asexual reproduction and a stage of sexual reproduction usually. And this is called an alternation of generations. And we're going to see it's very obvious, very easy to understand in the primitive plants. Not so easy to understand in the higher plants, but it is still present. So there is a rule, and that is that there is a haploid and a stage when the number of chromosomes has been halved, but we can have a whole organism, or at least a part of an organism, which is haploid, and that is called the gametophyte, and it produces gametes. When we have fusion of gametes, of an egg and sperm, whatever, we have a zygote, and the zygote will initially form a sporophyte. And the sporophyte is a diploid, and the sporophyte gives rise, that is in the sporophyte that meiosis takes place, and it produces haploid spores. And the haploid spores go off and form the gametophyte plant. And gametophyte plant produces gametes, they unite to form a new sporophyte. It sounds elaborate, but there are huge advantages to this because very often the gametophyte and the sporophyte could diverge. And evolutionary pressures were different on the gametophytes and the sporophytes. And we will see how dominance of one or the other becomes an important feature of the life cycle. Where am I? So here's why they're called the embryophytes, because one of the characteristics of all of them is that where that diploid embryo in the gametophyte, the diploid embryo is retained in the gametophyte. So the gametophyte is also, quite apart from producing the gametes, the female gametophyte is also a nurturing organism. And that is where the name embryophyte comes from. And this is one of the characteristics which actually allows them to begin to penetrate onto land, because the embryo is not exposed in this case to desiccation. It's protected by the plant itself, by the gametophyte plant itself. And we see this all the way up to the most advanced, or the most advanced land plants but in highly modified ways, as you'll understand much later on. So let's just have a look here. I just need to get rid of this so that I can see what I'm doing. Okay, so here's a typical alternation of generations. And this is for a fern, still regarded as being a relatively primitive land plant. But very, very clear alternation of generations between a sporophyte and a gametophyte. And it illustrates for us also some of the limitations that these primitive plants actually had to undergo. So here's a sporophyte. That is the kind of plant that you are familiar with seeing. This is the major form here in the ferns. The sporophyte is the major and long-lived plant. And the sporophyte produces spores. They undergo in a special area of the sporophyte, undergoes meiosis and produces spores. And they are haploid, N. But those N spores, they actually germinate under correct conditions. They will germinate. Very often the spores are resistant. They're resistant to desiccation, and they're fairly long-lived. They're very useful dispersal mechanism. It allows dispersion of the species over a wide area, instead of simply having all the young starting to compete with the parent nearby. So the spores, when they germinate, they undergo mitosis. But remember that they're undergoing mitosis with half of the number of chromosomes. They are haploid. So they produce an entirely haploid plant. Now, in the ferns, this is not always the case with the primitive plants, but in the ferns, the gametophyte is actually an obscure, very small little plant. It's about a centimeter at the most, and it's flat and usually in a relatively damp area for an important reason. First, and the gametophyte in most of the ferns, not in all of them, but in most of the ferns, the gametophyte has both male and female parts to it. And so it has female parts here, and it has male parts somewhere else. The male parts produce sperm, and the sperm have to swim to eggs, which are held here by the female gametophyte part. Here's one of the important limitations for the primitive plants. And it's something that held them close to water's edges or to areas where they could be assured of receiving regular drenching rain. And that is that they are absolutely dependent on water for their fertilization, because the sperm have to swim to the egg. So it's a big limitation for the primitive plants. Their fertilization requires the presence of water. And after such fertilization, they form a zygote, and they can form a plant. There's just one other thing I'll point out. Many of them, in actual fact, they can in fact fertilize themselves, but some of them can't. Some of them require gametes from another plant, from another gametophyte. So those sperm have still got to swim. They've still got to swim all the way to another gamete. So after fertilization, you have 2N. That 2N forms a sporophyte, and the sporophyte undergoes meiosis to produce the gametophyte. Okay, so here's an embryo. This is a fertilized egg being held. This is what I think is a fern gametophyte, and the embryo is being held here and is nourished by the maternal tissue. And in actual fact, this embryo ends up kind of being parasitic on the gametophyte. And the gametophyte is relatively short-lived and provides nutrients to the embryos until they grow up sufficiently to be independent sporophytes, and the gametophyte dies. The sporophyte is the long-lived portion of the plant life cycle. So that embryo is going to grow up to produce a sporophyte, and the sporophytes produce their spores in special areas of development called the sporangia, and it's within the sporangia that meiosis is going to take place. The cells inside are called the sporocytes, and they undergo meiosis to produce the haploid spores that are going to go off and form the gametophytes. And it's in those spore walls that sporopollenin is lodged. And that sporopollenin gives them an ability especially to resist desiccation. So this is was a huge and hugely important step in the colonization of land, because it meant that spores, for instance, could blow away from the parent plant, could settle in remote areas, and if those areas were suitable, new sporophytes could grow there. This is another of the primitive plants, and this is a moss. And the mosses are much more primitive than the ferns. They also have alternation of generations. But in the mosses, the life cycle is slightly different. It has many similarities to the ferns. But in the mosses, it is actually the gametophyte, which is the dominant plant. And when you look at mosses, if you go out now and look around, there are many, many mosses in many places because it's spring and they grow especially well and they tend to reproduce in spring. And all of the green leafy part of the moss that you see is gametophyte. And the sporophyte is actually parasitic on the gametophyte. And here it is here. So you've probably seen moss, leafy, green leafy, small things with a little club on the top of them. And that club on the top is the sporophyte. That is what's producing spores and is parasitic on the gametophyte. But the gametophyte here is very long-lived compared to the sporophyte. It's the dominant part of the life cycle. We'll do this in a little bit more detail in a minute. So the areas where on the gametophyte, where the gametes are produced are called the gametangia, and female gametangia are called the archegonia, and the males are called the antheridia. These are important names to remember because we're going to hear them again and again and again, all the way up to our discussions about the flowering plants. So the female areas that produce gametes, archegonia, and they produce the eggs, and the eggs are usually fertilized right there at the archegonium so that the embryo can be held by the gametophyte. The male gametangia are called the antheridia, and they release sperm, and the sperm are motile, they are flagellated and can swim. And they are actually attracted to archegonia. The archegonia emits substances which actually attract sperm to them to come and fertilize the egg. So this is another closely related to the mosses. This is a primitive plant called a liverwort. And these stalks here are actually the gametophytes. And they are, in this case, they're separate. They're not always separate. In other species may be together. But in these ones, they are separate. If we have a look, here's one here. You see it's got a flat top. Here's a stalk there, and it's got a flat top to it. This one here's the stalk, and it's got this star-shaped top to it. This is a female gametophyte. This is male gametophyte. And here are the antheridia in the male gametophyte. Each of these brown blobs will burst to release sperm. And the sperm then have to swim all the way to the eggs, which are in the archegonia. Okay, how is the sperm from here going to swim there? Is it going to swim down the side here and then swim all the way up here? Highly unlikely. Highly unlikely there's even enough water under normal circumstances for that to happen. This plant is absolutely dependent at some point or another on having standing water around it. It must, at some point or another, to complete its life cycle, it has to be flooded. And so, in fact, they are physiologically adapted so that the antheridia remain entire and closed under dry conditions. But as soon as they are flooded, the antheridia burst and release all the sperm, and the sperm then swim through the water to the archegonia. this points to an important limitation for these primitive plants. It's true of the ferns as well. They are absolutely dependent on water for their fertilization, for reproduction to be completed. And that provided a very big limitation to their dispersion and to their evolution. Okay, so here's another characteristic of the plants. I just pose a little riddle to you. And this riddle is, there's two people they are dating, and this is something which I do not recommend, but people used to do it. This gentleman goes and carves their initials in a tree, on the trunk of a tree, 6 feet high, carves their initials. And in 20 years' time, on their anniversary, they come back, oh, let's go find our initials on the tree. And the tree, in the meantime, has grown 20 foot. How high above the ground are the initials now? 26 feet?
Yes. It wouldn't be 26?
No. 6 feet. The initials are still at 6 feet because plants don't grow throughout their stem. Plants grow from the top. They grow from the apex. This is a characteristic of the plants, and it's not a characteristic of the algae. It's something unique to the plants. And it is actually a reflection of the fact that they came up onto land, and they have to grow against the force of gravity. And plants grow from their apex. They grow from the apex of the trunk, of the stem, from the apex of the branches, and from the tips of the roots underground. The stem does not increase in height. So the answer is no. John and Shanice, they're going to go there and they're going to find their initials exactly where they were before. And let's just go there. So that is one characteristic of the land plants. Here's another one. That is the land plants have to be able to resist the force of desiccation. And all of them show various adaptations, but one which is universal in the land plants is that they have a waxy coating over the outside tissues of the plant. The outside tissues are the epidermis. And all of them have some way of coating the epidermis to prevent evaporation. There is another characteristic of land plants which is does not appear in any of the algae, and that is that land plants and fungi have evolved very closely together. And in fact, they've evolved so closely together that in many cases we cannot separate them. The many plants have associated with them, especially around their roots, groups of fungi, which we call Mycorrhizae. And those Mycorrhizae have become essential to the plant because they govern uptake of nutrients, uptake of water. They even seem to govern the directions in which roots grow. All sorts of complex interactions take place between these symbiotic fungi and the plant roots. And that appears to have arisen very shortly after plants began to penetrate onto land. The third thing, which is really characteristic of land plants, is they have many mechanisms to deter herbivores. Because once the plants began to penetrate onto land and they grew, they grew densely and everything, initially there was no plant predators. There was no herbivores, but animals were evolving at exactly the same time. And those which moved up onto land successfully were either the herbivores, which could eat these abundant plants, or the predators, which could then eat the herbivores. So plants very soon needed to evolve if a line was to survive. It evolved things like secondary compounds, bitter compounds, poisons, toxins, these kinds of things in order to deter herbivores from eating them. So we know that by 475 million years ago, we had penetration of plants quite far into land, and we can find spores and plant tissues in rocks as early as 475 million years ago. And those were ancestral forms, primitive ancestral forms, but they are the ones who have given rise to all of the plants that we see currently. Here are some of the fossils. These are spores, and remember that spores are often resistant. They're able to blow far away, and those resistant coatings are what make them good candidates for being fossilized. So these are probably spores from ferns or something like that. So we are going to be talking about these different groups. Remember, they all evolved from a ancestral green alga, and we're going to watch as that ancestral alga gave rise to these various groups. I'll just point something out to you. These three groups, liverworts, mosses, and hornworts, you see these dotted lines here. Those dotted lines tell you that we don't really understand. We don't really understand the true relationships between these groups. We know that they are probably closely related. They certainly arose from a common, the original ancestor that gave rise to all of these groups, but their exact relationship we don't know. These groups here we understand much better. We are able to say with some certainty that there was a common ancestor to all of these groups here, and we know that there was a common ancestor to the two groups which have become dominant over the planet. And these are the gymnosperms, things like pine trees, all of those sorts of things, and the angiosperms, which are the flowering plants. So they very definitely have a common ancestor. The rest of this, I have to say, is often something of a mystery. But nonetheless, we're going to be looking at these various groups, and we'll mention some of the relationships between them. All right, so here is what we're going to discuss. We're going to first of all talk about these groups here, which are the mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. We'll just lump them all together. We usually refer to these as bryophytes. Here's the name here. These are the bryophytes. And it's a little bit confusing because the mosses are called the bryophyta, but all of them are bryophytes. So these have a very particular characteristic, and that is that they have no vasculature. The vascular plants are these groups here, the lycophytes, which you may not know about, and the ferns, which you definitely do know about. They are grouped together. They have a vasculature, but they do have no seed. And then the vascular plants, which have seeds, are the ones that we're going to spend some time talking about, the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. Okay, I'm going to stop there because you have a quiz which opens at 10 o'clock. The quiz is open until 4 o'clock this afternoon, so you can do it anytime during the day. You have 30 minutes to complete the quiz once you open it. Okay, are there any questions?
Is it possible you could leave the test open all day, because I'm leaving out for work now and I don't get off until 8?
Yes, I'll extend the time.
Thank you.
So you get back at 8?
I get off at 8. I'll be able to probably try and do it on the train.
How long does it take you to get home?
An hour.
Email me and I'll set a time for you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, just tell me your schedule and I'll set a time for you. All right.
Thank you.
Sure. Where am I?